everyone. Welcome. My name is Liz Nyode, and I am delighted to be here teaching you the third in a series of lessons in how to draw the human figure. I'm going to give you a quick recap of the things we've done thus far. The first lesson that we did warm-up exercises. Drawing, as any other skill, requires practice and warming up. Exactly as if you're a basketball player and you had to keep shooting multiple hoops in order to loosen up your body. So drawing needs that too. The warm-up exercises will help relax your upper body, your shoulders, your neck, your hands, your arms, and it will also help you access the right side of your brain, which is the more visual part of the brain. Then we did also for warm-up drawings that are called gestural drawings. They are very loose, free drawings in which you try to capture the gesture of the person's figure that you're looking at. Last week we did shading. I showed you how to build form through the use of shadow. This week we're going to bring it all together. We're going to do gestural drawing. We're going to go over the techniques of shading, and finally we're going to bring the gestural drawing together with the use of shading to create a more realistic looking figure. So tonight for our drawing I went to Pinterest, which I've been recommending to you in other lessons. If you go to Pinterest and just type in ballet poses, you're going to get magnificent images of dancers in motion. If you would prefer, you can get pictures of athletes in motion, and that will work just as well too. You want to find figures that are showing a lot of action and movement. It's counterintuitive, but the more complex the pose the person is in, the easier it is for you to capture what you are looking at. So tonight's image that I'm working from, I chose deliberately because the dancer is in a very extreme pose. Notice the way the rib cage of her body is thrown completely forward, as well as her hips. Her leg is thrust way back and up. And the complexity of this pose will force me to use the right side, the visual side of my brain, and that will help me to draw realistically. The other thing to notice in this photograph, this image, are the negative shapes, and we talked about this in the last two lessons. The empty space between her legs and arm, around her head and arms. If you can see those negative shapes, they will help you to create the positive image of her body. The other thing I'm going to spend some time talking about tonight is something called foreshortening. If you notice, her hip appears to be way larger than it would in real life. And that is because it's pushed forwards in the photograph, and it appears to be way bigger at the top of her hip than it would be in actual life. And we call that foreshortening. And here's another example of foreshortening. If I were to stick my hand right in front of your face, and I wanted to draw that hand, I would exaggerate the size of the hand because it appears to be way bigger than it actually is in reality. And the right side of the brain helps you to see foreshortening. And when you do your drawing, you want to use foreshortening, you want to enlarge the shapes that are protruding forward because it will help your picture look realistic. So now we're going to actually start drawing. Okay, so we're going to start drawing now. I want us to start first with the loose gestural drawing. Remember, the gestural drawing does not have to look realistic. This is when you're just trying to capture the motion of the figure that you're copying. Keep your lines loose, free, and fast. Use a number 2 pencil. For starters, you can always come back with your favorite drawing tool, whatever it is, uniball pen, graphite pencil, charcoal, but do start first with a number 2 pencil. So here we go. I'm going to start drawing. It's helpful to keep the image that you're working on to the right side of your paper if you're right-handed. If you're a left-handed artist, obviously the reverse would be helpful. Put your image on the left-hand side of the paper. I like to start with the head. Some artists prefer starting at the feet and working up. It's all good. Again, keep the initial drawing light. Keep referring to the photograph that you are looking at and look at relationships. Her knee, right at the armpit, diagonally across from her armpit. Her calf muscle, right underneath her forearm. It's quite large and bulging. And her ankle, believe it or not, is in line almost exactly with her elbow. And those kinds of relationships are what help you to draw the figure as realistically as possible. Think about foreshortening. Her leg is thrust way behind her body, and it makes the hip look huge. That's because of the way it's thrust forwards. So I'm going to make the top of her hip large. It's almost rectangular in shape. Kind of doesn't make sense because we think of the hip as rounded. You can see a little bit of the upper hip above. And then I'm going to sweep over to her rib cage. Notice the extreme curvature of the rib cage. And then right on up into the shoulder, the forearm. And here we have this beautiful negative shape between the right side of her left arm and the outer edge of her head. And I want to look at that and draw it because it will help me to actually draw the positive form of the figure. Now I'm going to go down to her right leg, which is extraordinarily long and straight. Let's measure. Head lengths. 1, 2, 3.5 head lengths from the hip all the way down to the point of her toe shoe. Quickly, I'm going to sketch that in. I'm going to emphasize the length and straightness of this incredibly long leg. All right. So now we have our light gestural drawing, and I'm going to go over it with graphite pencil. It will make it easier for you to see my quick gesture drawing. And now when I go back over the lighter lines, I can see more of the details and I can start adding them. So exciting. Things like her hairline. How far down on the back of her head does her hair extend on this incredibly curved neck? And I love this little piece of her shoulder extending right underneath her chin. The muscle of her shoulder, her forearm, all the way out to the wrist. Now, you may be able to see in my drawing, I don't have room for her hands, so I'm not drawing them. You should only draw what you can see. Okay, the underside of the arm, her elbow, and right down to her armpit, her upper back, and then the curve of this leg thrust up and back, down to her point shoe. The hand would be here if I could actually see it, so I'll go back and add the edge of the hand. The underside of this leg, her kneecap is here. The upper leg, and this foreshortened hip. It's just such a gorgeous shape here. All right, now her buttock is thrust way out. This is her now, her right leg. The curve of her leotard coming up. The outer curve of her torso and rib cage right on up into her left arm, bending over the top of her head. And here is this wonderful negative empty space between her arm, shoulder, neck, and back of the head. And here's her bun. You can't have a ballerina without her bun. Okay, so back to this very tall straight leg, the rounded curve of her buttock, down the back of the leg to the knee, all the way down to the ankle, and the laces of her toe shoe, and the outer edge, the knee, the calf to the ankle. Make it even a little darker. Then I really love the edge of her leotard is creating kind of a negative shape on her back. So I want to emphasize, here are the straps of the back of her leotard. Where are they in relation to the neck and the shoulder blade? And then the really awesome curve in the bottom half of the leotard up to the strap. The cutout of the leg portion of the leotard on her left leg, and the curve of the bottom of the leotard around her right leg. So here we are thus far with the outline of the drawing. You can see how much I've emphasized the foreshortening of the hip here, and this marvelous curve of her torso and rib cage. Then I really emphasize that long, gorgeous leg. All right, so this is enough now. We can start with our shading. I'm actually going to do the really fun part for me. I'm going to shade in and darken her leotard. I think of this leotard as not a leotard, but more as a shape in the drawing. And I want to emphasize it because I feel it will really make the torque, the twist of her body even more beautiful. So now I'm using graphite. You can also use the side of a number 2 pencil and get. Okay, so we'll continue filling in the leotard with very dark pencil. That's all graphite is. Don't forget, graphite is just what's inside a wooden pencil. The beauty of using these graphite pencils is it's softer than a number 2 pencil, but number 2 pencil works fine. And you can start spreading and blending the shadow. You can just use your index finger to blend the dark shadow. Or if you're lucky enough to have a stump tool, this is rolled up, tightly rolled up paper. You can use your stump. Paper towel, tissue would work if you don't want to get your fingers dirty. But you do want to blend this in. The leotard in the photograph that I'm copying is quite dark and solid. You really do not see too much light reflected off the fabric in this leotard. So have some fun making it as dark as possible. All right, the next thing I'm going to notice is where the light is hitting her figure. The light is coming from somewhere on the right of her body. Things that are protruding outwards or are facing the light are lighter than things that are going inwards. All right. The underside of things are darker. For example, underneath her chin, there's quite a bit of shadow. And don't forget the tip I gave you last week. Start light with your shading. You can always add more as you go. Look at this musculature along her spinal column, which is recessed into her back. There's quite a bit of darker shadow. Use that shadow to show that she is 3D. Notice that I'm erasing. There is nothing wrong with erasing, folks. All artists erase. We all make mistakes. But the beauty of working in pencil first is that you can erase and come back and make corrections. Underneath her shoulder blades, there's quite a bit of shadow. And I'm adding that now. And the back of her neck, there's this really cool muscle that goes from the bottom of her hair all the way down her neck. A little bit lighter than the rest of the shadow on her back. Shadow here underneath, I guess the leotard is bulging a little bit on her left side, and that's throwing shadow onto her skin. All right, now the legs. The top of her legs, or this leg, where we have the foreshortened hip, is darker because no light is hitting. Her hip, the underside of her left hip is in shadow, so I'm adding some shadow there. Notice again, I'm starting light. I will come back to add more shadow later. The left side of her calf muscle and the left side of her knee are in dark shadow. Her kneecap has some shading as well. You can actually see the joint of her knee protruding out. Notice how I'm blending the shadow with my finger as I go. If there's a hard edge between the darker shadow and the lighter part of the leg, it will flatten the image out. It'll give it a kind of cartoony feeling, which if you're going for realism, you don't want to have that. Blending of the shadow is so very important. All right, the shoulder in her right arm is in some very dramatic shadow, and I'm going to add that next. You can actually see her upper bicep, the shadow that's defining her upper bicep is quite distinct. This dancer has some beautiful arms as well as legs. The upper part of the arm is darker because of the way the light is hitting the figure. And now I'm going to go to the right leg, the straight leg. The whole left side of the right leg is in deep shadow. Remember, if you're drawing a curved object, you want the shading to be curved. Follow the curve of the form you're actually looking at. And see how I keep referring back to the photograph that I'm trying to copy? I'm not trying to draw her from memory. I know I can never be accurate if I try to draw from memory. Alright, so we're almost done. It seems daunting and difficult, but when you break the human figure down into form, shapes, negative shapes around it, foreshortened areas, and you try to forget that it's a person that you're drawing, and try and just see it as a series of shapes, you will find it becomes quite easy. And the more you do, the more practice you get, the easier it will become. So I'm darkening her hair. She has beautiful black hair, as dark as her leotard. You can see a bit of her eyebrow. I'll darken that. The tip of her nose. Is protruding out from the side of her face. A bit of dark shadow behind her ear. A curl coming around the front of her ear. A little bit of shadow on what you can see of the inner ear. There's not much you can actually see though. And then finally, some shading on this arm. This arm is pretty much in darkness because her head is casting a shadow. The definition in her shoulder is quite extraordinary. She's quite muscular. The outer part of her arm is darker than the inner part. So at this stage, I'm not really finished with my drawing, but rather than take up all the time when you could be having fun doing your own drawing, I'm going to hold up what I've created so that you can see how shadow helps to define the form and make it look realistic. So here is my drawing. Here is the drawing I'm copying, and you can see that I've captured the gesture, the motion. So I hope you can see the effectiveness, the usefulness of shading in creating a three-dimensional form on two-dimensional surface. How much more real does the figure look now that we've added the shading? There's more work to be done on this, and we will work next week on adding further details and also working in color. That will be our final lesson in drawing the human figure. In April, we are going to start looking at the work of Asian American artists and the huge contribution that they've made to the history of art and culture in the United States. And before we leave tonight, I want to remind you all to visit the Hoboken Library website to find the whole series of lessons that they are hosting. A major, major thank you to the Hoboken Library for allowing us this opportunity to do art while we're sheltering in place. Thank you, Hoboken.